Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode I call Aliens, Aliens, Aliens 100 Years of Humanoids, 13 True Cases. Yeah, it's a long title, but this is going to be a long episode, and it's on my favorite topic, face-to-face encounters with humanoids. I just really want to drive it home that people are seeing all different kinds of humanoids all over the world for a very long period of time. So I have 13 cases I've chosen, which I think each have something unique to provide to our understanding of extraterrestrial contact. And yeah, cases reaching back 100 years, from the 1920s all the way to the 2020s. And these are cases coming from all over the world, in Canada, all across the United States, South America, all across Europe, England, Turkey, Israel, Spain, cases from Australia, really all over the globe, which again is an important fact. A lot of people already know this, but this is absolutely a global phenomenon. And the variety of humanoids is truly astonishing. What I also love about a lot of these cases is that they provide all kinds of really compelling evidence. So once again, we have pretty much the whole range of evidence involving everything from electromagnetic effects and landing traces and medical effects, all of these kinds of things. So these are all important cases in their own right. I think most of these are probably not very well known. You may have heard of a few of them, but actually I highly doubt it. There are far more cases of this kind than most people realize. It's one of the reasons I do this work, because people need to know that this is going on. So yeah, a long episode today, so let's just get started. In the first case I want to talk about, I call Under the Protection of Aliens. And this occurred a long time ago in August of 1923 in Barcelona, Spain. For all of his young life, 12-year-old Jacques B Bley suffered from pathological obesity, which was causing him all kinds of problems. He was failing in school because of it. And then, one night in August of 1923, he felt compelled to go out onto the terrace of his home, which actually overlooked the ocean. And this is when he saw an actual fleet of, quote, delta-shaped vehicles of massive and metallic appearance. And as he watched, three of them rose up and to his amazement actually landed on his terrace. And they weren't huge, as he said, quote, their dimensions oscillated between 6 and 10 feet. And as he watched, one of them kind of fanned open in a very unusual way, and out came this little man, who he said was about 4 feet tall, wearing a shiny cloth overall, which covered most of his body, and which seemed to Jacques almost like it was covered with diamonds. It was very sparkly. And, per the witness, this being then approached him, quote, hardly touching the ground with his feet. So basically floated over to him and then said that they had, quote, taken him under their protection. At this point, something very interesting happened. This being gave him a large square piece of something that looked like chocolate. Of course, it wasn't chocolate. It tasted really bad, kind of like tar, but he did eat it. And at this point, the being said that Jacques would now become strong, both in body and intelligence. The being then re-entered into the craft, and all three craft took off at high speed. Now, the after effects, of course, were amazing. The first after effect was that Jacques said the taste of this chocolate, we'll call it, remained in his mouth for the rest of the day. But immediately he began to notice improvements. And over the next 3 years, Jacques actually began to lose weight, gain muscle mass, and became a very powerful athlete, did really well in school. He later began performing as a gymnast at a circus, and then became a mountain climber. And he had some very amazing things happen to him. He was involved in a war, a conflict, and he actually survived a gunfire attack from apparently hired killers who fired at him from only 12 feet away, but he says none of the bullets hit him. And later, he became a hugely successful businessman and was reportedly the wealthiest man in Andorra. He also later claimed to have the ability of hands-on healing. So his case was investigated apparently by Antonio Ribera, who wrote a book about him. According to some sources, this is under a pseudonym, but is really Antonio Ribera. And then he reportedly passed away in 2011 at age 100. Certainly a controversial case, and there are some who have criticized it or questioned its authenticity. I think it's hard to say. It certainly does have a lot of details we hear in other UFO accounts, so you can make up your own mind about it. But I think it was definitely worth presenting because it's quite popular in Spain, actually, and has been covered on a number of shows. And here is another very interesting case. I call this one the alien in the backyard. This one occurred in May of 1930 in Greensboro, North Carolina. And there's some really interesting reasons that I put this case forward. So this case does come from researcher George D. Fawcett, who was given the account by two sisters, Dr. Catherine I. Rankin and Mary Frances Rankin, who was a school teacher. Now, these sisters were told the story by their parents, who told them that one day in May of 1930, during broad daylight, they saw a UFO actually land in the backyard of their home on Pearson Street. This is in Greensboro, North Carolina. They said this object was clearly not normal. It moved both horizontally and vertically, and when it landed, they saw that it was shaped like a top, dark in color, and about 40 feet wide. They said it appeared to be hollow because inside they were startled to see, through a window, the head and shoulders of an occupant. They couldn't see him super clearly, but close enough that they could see that he wore a dark, tight-fitting garment and a tight-fitting helmet over his head. And they watched this for a good 5 or 10 minutes, when suddenly, without warning, the object rose vertically in perfect silence and moved off into the distance. So this was their very close encounter, and Mr. and Mrs. Rankin later shared their sighting with their two daughters, who shared it with researcher George D. Fawcett. What I like about this case is it was investigated by a professional researcher, George Fawcett. Another interesting thing about it is that this occurred during broad daylight. It was a very close-up landing, really no chances for misperception here. Also, the main witnesses never publicly reported it, which means they weren't seeking publicity, money, or fame, or anything like this, which I think lends a level of authenticity and credibility to their account. They never wavered from their story and only told it to their daughters. And yeah, it's just plain interesting. And now we move to the next case, which is quite brief, but it's got some very interesting aspects to it for sure. I call this one the alien who came to say hello. This occurred on July 9, 1947, literally days after the very famous Roswell UFO crash in New Mexico. That's one of the reasons I wanted to present it. I think that's an interesting coincidence. And this one occurred in Houston, Texas, and as you'll see, it's quite a strange case. The main witness in this case is anonymous. All we know is that he's a sailor, a merchant seaman, and he called the Houston Post newspaper with an incredible story. And as the reporter of the Houston Post says, "Here is the disc yarn to end all saucer stories in a disc-dizzy nation." At the time, there was a huge super wave going on. And of course, this is days after the Roswell UFO crash. But at any rate, the sailor told the reporter that he was absolutely sober, did not drink, but said that he was walking into his Acres Home addition in Houston, Texas, when, quote, a little man 2 feet tall and with a head the size of a basketball climbed out of the disc. Now he said it shook hands with him and then climbed back in and whirled away into the blue. Now the reporter asked the sailor, did he look like a man from Mars? And the sailor reported, I don't know. I never saw a man from Mars. A very short case. Admittedly, that case was not investigated really at all. It's just a very quick newspaper article and a conversation with a reporter. But it's fascinating because the witness insists that he's telling the truth. And as strange as the behavior of this ET sounds, I do know of many other cases where UFOs landed, ET came out, basically walked up to the witness just to say hello, shake their hand, go back into the craft, and the craft takes off. So in that regard, it's not unique, but certainly is unusual and quite a strange case to say the least. And here is another case. I love it that there's always another case because skeptics can say, oh, where's the proof? Well, there's an enormous amount of evidence, and there's just case after case after case after case. If even one of these is true, it's a game changer, and I think probably most of them are true. And this case is certainly interesting, although controversial. It was thoroughly investigated. I call this one the handsome, human-looking alien. This occurred on August 20, 1954. Right at the beginning end of a massive wave which swept across Europe, really mostly France, but Italy as well, and really all of Europe. This one occurred in Mosjøen, Norway. It involves 2 witnesses and is a fascinating account of a human-looking ET. The 2 witnesses in this case are again sisters. Their names are Asta Salvang, age 32, and her sister Edith Jacobson, age 24. Both were married. They were out with their uncle picking blueberries. They became separate from their uncle, and while walking around looking for blueberries, they saw a man approaching them from a distance. Now they thought at first that he was out there to pick blueberries too, but he had nothing in his hands. So they were very curious about that, but still assumed he was just a normal person. At some point, that opinion would change. Because as Edith says, we were frightened at first, but the man appeared very friendly and stepped towards us. We walked towards him and wondered who he was. As we got near him, he smiled and stretched out his hand. I too smiled and held out my hand, but he only brushed my palm with his. Then he began to talk, but we didn't understand a word. It didn't resemble any language I had heard. So things were getting stranger. He didn't shake hands like a normal person, and this was a very strange language. And according to the witnesses, his voice was very soft and melodious. And not unable to understand what he was saying, they began to address him in, of course, their native tongue, Norwegian, and he didn't understand that. So they tried French, German, and English. But, as they said, and I quote, he didn't seem to understand a word. So at this point, they're still thinking he must be a foreigner from another country, but they began to examine him more closely, because it was all very curious. And, as Edith says, he was of medium height, had pleasant regular features and long hair with a natural wave. He was rather dark. We didn't notice the color of his eyes, but I believe they were slightly oblique. His hands were beautiful and expressive, with fine, long fingers. He was clothed in a kind of greenish overall, but as he wore a broad belt, it could have been trousers and a blouse. The blouse fitted closely at the neck. I could not see any buttons, zippers, or fasteners. The thing that impressed us above all was the genuine friendliness he emanated. It gave us a feeling of goodness and security, so that we did not feel in the least bit alarmed at the encounter. His smile convinced us that he did not contemplate anything evil. So they elaborated and said that his hair, while long, was not past his shoulders, that his eyes were somewhat slanted and unusual. His overall was tight-fitting, and he seemed like a very, very friendly person. But it was clear to them both that there was a language barrier, and this is when the man produced a mirror-like sort of grayish tablet, circular, and a writing instrument of some kind. They didn't pay too much attention to what it was because they were still thinking he's a normal guy. But he began to draw several circles, at which point he started gesturing to the landscape around them, pointed to them, at himself, and then another circle. And as Edith said, I had the impression he wanted to tell us something about the solar system. So she thought he was trying to explain where he came from. And this is when she really started to get even more curious, both of them. Then the man motioned for them to follow him. So they did. And soon they approached a, quote, curious contraption. And according to the witnesses, it looked like two, quote, pot lids, placed edge to edge, was metallic, gray-blue in color, not super big, about 10 feet wide and 5 feet tall at the most, 4 or 5 feet. And in fact, it was so small that it really surprised Edith, because she said there was no way a full-grown adult could even stand up inside it. And as they started to get even closer, the man motioned them to stop and not approach too closely. And he started to walk towards the craft. And as Edith says, he then opened a kind of hatch at the top of the rim, which encircled the thing, crawled in, and shut himself in. Presently, we heard a faint humming, like the droning of a large bumblebee, and the curious vessel rose slowly while rotating on its own axis. So at this point, the sisters now realized that this was very unusual. This was probably a flying saucer that had started to get some real attention. And they watched as this craft rose to about 100 feet and then moved at, quote, tremendous speed and disappeared. So they were absolutely exhilarated and amazed by the sighting. They vowed not to tell anyone for fear of being disbelieved, did not tell their uncle at first, shortly after hooking up with them again. But a few days later, Asta's husband noticed that she was sort of out of sorts and kept asking her questions about it, and she revealed what happened. And this was when word began to spread through, this was a small town, and soon the local police heard about it, who brought both the girls in for questioning. They interviewed them extensively, actually went out to the site to look for any evidence, which they couldn't find, but by this point 6 days had passed. But soon word spread and reporters started to come and interview the witnesses. And this turned everything upside down. As Edith said, after that, we couldn't venture out without being stopped in the street to tell the story anew. Many people laugh at us, and many are angry because they believe we are pulling their legs. But we have only told the story of something that definitely happened to us. We saw it simultaneously, and we reacted in the same way. But the questioning we went through was so intense that at times I thought I would lose my reason. I earnestly wish that some responsible person, like a police official or a parson, had had the experience. At least they would have been believed. Now their uncle was skeptical. He wouldn't accuse the girls of outright lying, but he did say that he just didn't believe in flying saucers. However, their mother says she knows her daughters wouldn't lie. And she says, I'm obliged to believe that my daughters are telling the truth and that they have really seen what they say they have seen. And many others who know the girls also vouched for their honesty. So this was apparently Norway's first recorded encounter of a landed UFO and humanoid. and it pretty much split the town into two parts, those who believed and those who didn't. Those who knew the girls did stand by them. Others were skeptical. The police did say that the two witnesses were sober and trustworthy. Reporters repeatedly tried to catch them in contradictions, but failed to do so. Reporters asked everyone in town. Many said that they absolutely believe the witnesses, but didn't want their name used because there was so much controversy surrounding this incident. What's super interesting is that Project Blue Book actually heard about this case, and apparently without doing any investigation, said that the woman had seen an American helicopter piloted by Billy Foreau. So, reporters contacted him, and he denied any such incident and explained that the description the woman gave didn't even come close to matching what he looked like. And the two witnesses stuck to their story to the day they died. And again, as it turned out, this was one of the first of a huge wave of saucer landings that spread across Europe. There's a lot to like about that account. It's clear that while there was controversy in the town about whether or not these two sisters were telling the truth, those who knew the sisters absolutely believed their story for the most part. And again, it was thoroughly investigated. The details they describe are now well known, but certainly weren't back then. They also tried to keep it secret. It was only one of the sisters who finally told her husband, because he was so concerned about why she was acting so strangely, that this case was revealed at all and was widely published in newspapers. It's interesting that Project Blue Book took an interest in it and tried to debunk it with a ridiculous explanation, as they often did. But yeah, certainly an interesting case, and not unique. There are many other cases like it, but wow, what an amazing experience those two sisters had. And now we move to our next case. Moving through time, this next case I call the alien at the ice skating rink. This is a single witness case, though it does involve some very interesting physical evidence. It occurred on November 28, 1972. This one occurred in Canada, more specifically in La Sarre, Quebec, Canada. And it's an unusual case for sure. It was a cool sunny morning around 10:30 a.m., again on November 28, 1972, when 9-year-old Mario Mercier was ice skating on a natural sort of ice rink next to his home. There were little goalies set up. This is where people played hockey. And he watched with astonishment as a strangely spherical, quote, white cloud dropped rapidly from the sky and landed next to his house about 700 feet away. And it was a tiny little thing, about 7 feet in diameter, but all misty, so he wasn't sure what this thing was. And he became even more shocked when 3 beings, each about 4 feet tall, emerged from this, quote, cloud. These beings were clothed entirely in black and looked almost robotic. They had very square-cut shoulders, black square helmets. One of them was carrying a small black object in its hand, which Mario said looked to him like a kettle. And to his amazement, this being bent down and began to fill this container with snow. At that point, the figure walked over to Mario's chicken coop and started to open the door. At this point, Mario completely freaked out, and he actually cried out audibly. And apparently hearing Mario, this being turned towards him and realized he was being observed. Mario was frightened and hid in the hockey net at the end of the rink as this being quickly went back and joined the other 2 beings, all of who climbed back into this cloud-like object, which then rose straight up and was gone. So clearly not a cloud. But at this point, Mario ran home, told his family what happened, and they came out and all of them saw strange square footprints in the snow. Also, where this object had landed, they found a 10-foot diameter of black soot and burned vegetation. And in fact, this mark remained for 2 years, and no grass would grow there during that time. What I like about that case is, again, it's a daylight case, a landing. The witness saw this object quite close. The ETs described are very unusual, the rare, perhaps robotic type, though we can't be sure. That could have just been your typical sort of space suit. But certainly interesting also because the ETs behaved in ways that we do often see, scooping up water, or in this case, snow, investigating the chicken coop. And really compelling is the fact that this object apparently left physical evidence, not to mention the footprints, which were seen by the witness's family. So, very interesting details all around with that case. And here we have another truly bizarre case, which created quite a stir in the community where it occurred. It's very unusual. I call this one the alien in the living room. And this occurred on November 28, 1972 in Argentina, more specifically in the suburb Tres Arroyos in Buenos Aires. And this case, just a warning here, is very unusual. The primary witness in this case is Alfonso Rey. He was a retired chief designer at IMA metallurgical firm and also a pilot. And he was in his home at Calle 346 Libertad, again in Tres Arroyos, and was just watching TV, sitting in his easy chair, when the TV set began to fail. So he didn't know what was wrong. He got up to fix it, and this is when he felt a strange impression, an uneasiness. And turning around, he saw a very unusual looking figure sitting down in an armchair in his living room. And he said this figure was not normal. It wore a one-piece metallic green overall. It had short boots, a black belt with what looked like a radio-type device attached to it, and a helmet over his head. And as soon as Alfonso saw him, this being stood up. And this is when Alfonso realized that he was quite tall, over 6 feet in height. And Alfonso asked him, "What do you want?" This figure made no reply, but held out its hand, apparently in greeting. So Alfonso walked up and took the being's hand, which he said felt cold and had a strange texture which he likened to foam rubber. He said he could see the figure's eyes visible through the helmet, and that they seemed to emit a silvery light, which was bright enough that it was hard for him to distinguish the being's facial features. So at this point, Alfonso sat down in his chair. The being did the same. And this figure never spoke, but just stared at Alfonso. And at this point, Alfonso said that he felt a, quote, very good sense of well-being. And in fact, he had been in physical pain since suffering a stroke a few years earlier. And to his amazement, all these pains disappeared. So he was absolutely astonished, got up and went to the kitchen, and this being followed him. And according to Alfonso, who didn't so much walk as seemed to float on the air. Alfonso turned on the gas cooker. I'm not sure why he's doing this, apparently making tea or something. It's not explained in the report. However, there was an interesting effect because the sparks from the igniter on the stove were much stronger than usual. That was strange, Alfonso thought. He also noticed that his refrigerator motor seemed to be faltering, and he himself felt very peculiar. At this point, he offered the visitor a glass of water, which the visitor declined. So he went back into the living room. The being followed him, and when they got in there, this being started to press some buttons on the radio-like device on his belt, which began to blink with an amber-colored light. So Alfonso was starting to feel some fear at this point. He didn't know who this being was. He was starting to realize this might not even be human.
So he started to retreat to the kitchen, but the being followed him, then walked to the doorway to the yard, pressed some more buttons on his belt, and then walked out into the yard. So Alfonso was watching all this. The being looks up into the sky and then quickly vanishes without a trace. So this was the story he told. And what's interesting is later that afternoon, other people apparently saw this same figure. It's further confirmation of his testimony, because not far away, at a bar at the corner of Alsina and Pringles, it was later that afternoon, several witnesses reported seeing a strange figure of similar description actually enter the bar, and everyone who was there watched him enter the bar and go directly to the bathroom, and he didn't come out. So at some point when he didn't come out, the bartender went to investigate and discovered that the bathroom was now empty. So she called the police, took the testimony of the witnesses who saw this being, and were able to confirm this incident. So certainly a bizarre case.
But once again, we have ETs coming into people's homes and interacting with them in almost casual ways. It's quite an interesting encounter, which I think is made all the more compelling because there were electromagnetic effects, also physiological effects. The witness certainly feels like he was healed as a result of this encounter, but most compelling is the fact that there were apparently other witnesses who saw what they believed to be the same figure in another area a short time after the initial encounter. And very strange, it was investigated by police. So again, I think that lends a level of credibility to it. The main witness of the initial event is also a person of very high standing, a professional, quite intelligent. So all around, a really interesting case. And moving along in time, we go to the next case, which I call the alien at the side of the road. And this case was very thoroughly investigated, and it occurred on February 4th, 1973 in Kimba, Australia. And it's a great case, initially involving just 2 witnesses, but as it turns out, there were more witnesses, and just a very unusual event. It was 9:50 p.m. when Brian Hunt was driving from Iron Knob to Kimba along Highway 1, also known as the Erie Highway, and they were about 35 miles outside of Kimba when he initially saw a, quote, red flare. This was just off to the right side of the road, but with him in the car in the front passenger seat was his friend Sharon Finkler. Now, he didn't say anything to her at first until they got closer, and as he began to drive by, he looked and saw that this light was actually an orange-red triangle. He estimates it was 5 feet wide, 10 feet high, and clearly visible inside it was a motionless human figure who appeared to be floating about 2 feet above the ground and was dressed in, quote, a white spacesuit. According to Brian, the figure's hands and legs were pointed slightly down. Brian had been driving a steady 55 miles per hour, but seeing this figure and becoming frightened by its odd appearance, he started to accelerate. And at the same time, he motioned for his friend Sharon to take a look out the window. So Sharon looked and saw the same thing, this orange-red rectangle, and what she perceived as kind of a white blob inside. She didn't get a super good look at it, because by then they were already passing this thing. But she looked back and said that it looked to her like this thing was extending across the road. So they were both somewhat alarmed by this. They sped off, went to Kimba, where Sharon lived, and shared the story with her parents. And after listening to them, they decided to call the police.
The police decided to conduct an investigation, actually went to the location, but found no physical evidence. However, it turns out there were other witnesses, because the next day they received a call from a gentleman by the name of Alan Degnor, a truck driver, who said that around 10 p.m. he had seen what he thought was a glowing white door of a trailer in the same exact spot. He also saw a strange figure, he said, and it was odd because he couldn't see any structure around this door. Now later, researcher Keith Basterfield, who investigated this case along with several other researchers, did locate another witness, Max Inglis, who described seeing the same thing. He didn't see any figure, however, and as it turned out, he was driving just ahead of Brian Hunt and Sharon Finkler. But it was a pretty impressive case with so many witnesses, and as Keith Basterfield writes, one is left with a firm impression that these people witnessed a real event of some kind. This is certainly one of the most puzzling reports I have investigated.
While a whole lot didn't really occur in that case, it was just a drive-by of seeing this ET standing in a doorway. No one actually saw the actual craft itself, which was probably because it was quite dark. Hard to say for sure, but yeah, the main witness, Keith Basterfield, said it was one of the most interesting cases he's come across in a very long time. So that alone is interesting. And so many witnesses. It was clear that the main witnesses were very shook up. It's an interesting case. And now we move to what is probably one of my favorites, certainly, in this little collection. I call this one The Cross-Eyed Aliens. This occurred on April 30th, 1983 in Saspel, France. And I love this case because it was quite an extensive interaction between the main witness and several human-looking ETs. The main witness in this case is anonymous. She is called Madam X, and she is 60 years old. It was around 2 a.m. when she woke up to see a glowing red sphere hovering in her bedroom. Now, she couldn't understand what she was thinking or what she was seeing and thought it might be ball lightning. So she tried to awake her husband, but he wouldn't wake up. He's normally a heavy sleeper, but she was surprised that he wouldn't wake up. She jumped up to open the window, and when she turned around, this red sphere was gone, and in its place stood 4 strange-looking men. And this weird orange light sort of filled the room. She said the men were each under 6 feet tall and looked quite unusual. They were human-looking, but had long faces, very pale skin, long thin noses that were sort of attached differently, and their eyes were very strange. They had pupils that looked like they were situated kind of close to the nose, giving them almost a cross-eyed appearance. She said they wore overalls, which were unmarked except for what looked like yellow and green bars on the shoulders, which she thought might indicate rank, given that they were uniforms. This was her impression. She couldn't tell if they had hair or not because their heads were actually covered with tight skull caps. But she wasn't scared. She said they seemed very friendly, not at all threatening, so she felt no fear. But she really wanted her husband to see them, so again she tried to shake him awake, and he wouldn't wake up. And this is when one of the entities spoke verbally in French, saying, "It's useless. He is sleeping." And that was kind of strange, but Madame X also noticed that her 4 normally aggressive German shepherds were now cowering under the bed, and their eyes were bulging as they stared fearfully at these visitors. So, at this point, still feeling no fear, Madame X invited these visitors to sit down, which they did, and she asked them, "Do you speak other languages?" And they told her, "We know all the languages on Earth." Now, it was just one entity who spoke. He would do all the talking,
Madame X assumed that he was the leader, and he asked her, "Do you know who we are?" So she studied them, and she had noticed at this point they moved strangely, leisurely but kind of deliberately, and that they were very slow in their movements and gestures. So she said, "You're robots." Now at this point, this entity smiled with what she perceived to be amusement, held out his hand, and said, "Touch," which she did. And she noticed at this point that their hands were slightly larger than most people and very soft. And of course, she could tell now that they were, in fact, living beings because their hands felt like normal flesh. So she said, "Then you are extraterrestrials." And the ET said, "Yes." So at this point, her mind is whirling. She wanted to test them to see if they could speak other languages, but said that even though she was strangely calm and unafraid, she was having trouble thinking and formulating her questions, almost as if her willpower, she said, was slowed down. At this point, they stood up, rose from their seats, and led her outside, telling her that they wanted to show her that they were well acquainted with the history of planet Earth. So this was strange, but going outside, she was surprised to see 4 additional entities outside, looking the same as the others. She also noticed that the entire yard was enveloped in a thick fog, and it had been a chilly night, but she was surprised that it was now quite warm, certainly where she was standing. So at this point they returned back inside to the bedroom momentarily when the main guy said, "Here, it's fine. We are going to make a projection for you." And they returned back outside. At this point, Madame X saw that 3 of the 4 other ETs now held small black spheres in their hands. And then they began to project sort of like a movie screen on the fog, showing her images of Earth's history. She said, reaching all the way back to prehistory up through World War II. She said almost all of the images were focused on wars and conflicts and battles. And seeing this, she told them that she had no interest in wars. But their reply was that conflict is all that the people of Earth know. So there was a clear message there. And she believes these images were being projected by the black spheres, though studying them, she could see no beams of light coming from them. So she's honestly not sure how that was done. But after that, which went on for quite some time, she and the first 4 ETs returned inside and sat down again. And with some effort, Madame X began to ask questions. She started questioning about time and distances in space and things like this. But their only response to all these questions was that she wouldn't understand. She did ask them why there were only men in their group, and the leader replied that sometimes they do bring females along, but just had not done so on this occasion. So Madame still felt no fear, and instead felt this overwhelming happiness to be meeting them. And in fact, she invited them to eat or drink or even smoke. They smiled and declined, but said that they would visit again in 6 months and would dine with her at that point. Now, during all of this, a few of the beings in the room kept glancing out the window as if to make sure that they weren't being observed or there was no disturbance. She's not sure. But after, she says, 2 hours, these ETs suddenly rose and exited her room. And right before they did so, she stepped forward and shook the leader's hand, followed them outside. And this is when she saw a UFO for the first time, an oval or saucer-shaped object, which was floating above the terraced front yard about 75 feet from the house. These were terraces that dropped down in level, so this object was actually at eye level, and it had a ramp which extended horizontally to the top of the shed in the front yard. And as she watched, these ETs walked across this ramp and into the craft. The ramp retracted. This object took off with what she described as a soft whistling noise. And they were gone. So she stood there a moment in absolute astonishment, considered waking up her husband and calling the police and telling the priest, but finally decided not to tell anyone because it was such an incredible experience that she didn't think anyone would believe her. But she also says that right after the ETs left, her sense of calmness and well-being left her, and she felt this wave of, quote, indescribable panic. And it was so intense that it was something she had never experienced before. So she kept her secret for about 2 weeks. But her neighbor came over and started talking about ETs, and that's when she spilled out her story. And this ultimately resulted in Madame X's case being professionally investigated. Now, after 6 months went by, the ETs did not return. However, the witness is hopeful that one day they will. She says the only other effect is she has become very nervous about Earth's future and the possible arrival of the, quote, end times. So a very interesting case where once again the ETs are warning about war.
I think there's a lot of takeaways from that case. Like many witnesses, she did keep it secret for some time, finally revealed it, was never planning on talking about it publicly, so it's pure chance that we're now hearing about it. But the fact that the ETs were warning her about war and aggression and all the violence on our planet, that's certainly the message we get from a lot of contactee accounts. It's just a really interesting case, again with weird medical effects, and that her husband couldn't be woken up. I would call that a physiological effect. And animal reactions as well, where her dogs absolutely would not come out from under the bed while those ETs were there. And a very long case. I mean, I can only imagine what it must be like to talk for 2 hours with ETs. And as we saw, it had a very profound effect upon the main witness. All right, moving along. The next case is super amazing. And I have to say it's also one of my favorite in this collection. It's hard to pick a favorite because they're all so interesting. This one I call the Giant Silver Alien. This occurred fairly recently, March 20th, 1993, in Kadima, Israel. And boy, did it create a sensation when it occurred, because there wasn't just one witness, there was many follow-up events, but there were the landing traces as well. Some very profound physiological effects. Really an extraordinary case in terms of what the ETs looked like as well, as we shall see. It was 6:30 a.m., very early in the morning, when Zipporette Carmel, a lady, was surprised to find herself waking up so early. And I'm just going to quote her extensively because she describes what happens in this amazing case in amazing detail. As she says in her own words, and I quote, "I'm a late sleeper, and I seldom get up that early. And this was Saturday, a day I always sleep late. But something disturbed me, and I felt drawn to walk to the kitchen. When I got there, the room was bathed in a strange light. This, even though the sun was up. I went outside and checked the grounds, and as I went around the storage shed, I noticed what I thought was a new fruit silo in the field about 100 meters from me. I remember thinking, why would anyone put a silo there, and in the middle of the night at that? I took a closer look at the silo and realized this was no ordinary container. It was silver colored for one thing, which is not standard for silos. It seemed almost square-shaped from the angle I was looking, and along its side were 18 glowing square windows, which looked like diamonds in a necklace. 5 huge beams of powerful light shone from the roof into the northern sky, and the silo was emitting what looked like sparklers along its side. I guessed the size of the silo to be about 5 meters in length and about 3 meters high.
But then it seemed to grow another story. By that, I mean a second section materialized and doubled the height of the silo. Then I saw what at first I thought was a worker a few meters from the silo. When I saw him, so did the dogs, and they went crazy. The worker was over 7 feet tall and wore metallic overalls, something like aluminum foil. He wore a sombrero with a veil that covered his face, and that in totality looked like a beekeeper's hat. We both stared at each other for perhaps 30 seconds, and I realized finally who he was. I quietly whispered, "Why don't you take off your hat so I can see your face?" And I heard his answer clearly in my head. He said in Hebrew, "Kakazeh," meaning, "That's the way it is." After that, I felt impelled to go to my kitchen and boil some coffee, and when I went back outside, the ship and its occupant was gone. So quite an amazing and bizarre encounter, but the surprises weren't over yet, because when they went to examine the field, they found a 15-foot diameter round circle of, quote, dissolved vegetation, where this craft had been. And next to it, where this being had stood, was another 4-foot diameter circle. And inside this larger circle, they found deposits of what later turned out to be exceptionally pure silicone, certainly not naturally forming. And it was only 2 weeks later when more strange circles were found in her backyard. And some had this strange red fluid inside them, which was collected and tested and turned out to be mostly cadmium. So very strange. But wait, there's more. Because following this encounter, the main witness, Zipporette, said, "I was nauseous for days, had horrible diarrhea, fits of shivering, and couldn't stop sleeping. It was like a bad flu." So this case was thoroughly investigated, and many other people came to look at these landing traces. And what's very interesting is those who stood too long in the circle did suffer physiological effects. Barry Chamish, who investigated this case, reported that he felt very sick after standing in the circle, as did another researcher, Danny Jacobi, who says he got sick, but after he felt the sickness, the arthritis in his knees disappeared. Formerly, he had to walk with a cane. His arthritis was so bad. And researcher Avi Grief had a similar reaction, and as he says, "I had a painfully weak ankle that always impaired me. It was repaired after visiting the Carmel landing site and has never returned. My theory is that there is something healing in that initial sick feeling." So certainly something's going on. And in fact, 8 months later, the lead investigator, Barry Chamish, visited the landing site and the circle was still there. So he's standing inside it, and Zipporette warned him, don't stay in there too long. But he did, because as Barry says, "I couldn't resist looking for signs of the landing that might have been overlooked. After scratching through the burnt and charred remains of wood and plastic and digging through the still burnt roots of the former plant life for about 20 minutes, I felt genuinely lousy, like a flu was approaching, and spent the remainder of the day mooching painkillers from the people I was interviewing. I told Zipporette that if she hadn't planted the suggestion in the first place, I wouldn't have had a psychosomatic reaction." So he was skeptical, but she replied, "It wouldn't have made a difference. Everyone who stays too long at the spot gets sick after." So they should have tested it perhaps for radiation. I'm not sure that they did that, but there were other strange after effects to Zipporah, the main witness. She found that she could now see auras, and she says she also believes she has gained healing powers. So certainly a very interesting case, and as it turns out, it was the first of several cases involving UFO sightings, landings, and also entity sightings as well. Wow, what a case.
And really, I could have done a whole show on just the series of events that occurred afterwards, because there were many, many other witnesses who were having sightings and landings. And I mean, there's a lot to that case that we didn't cover here, but you can certainly look into it because, wow, I mean, it's amazing. And here's another really compelling case, which I call the little alien gray boy. And this one is super interesting for a number of reasons. It occurred on March 1998 in Fajardo, Puerto Rico. It involves one witness in terms of the actual humanoid being seen, the gray alien boy, but there was remarkable confirmation with multiple witnesses immediately after this gentleman's encounter with this little gray alien boy. It was around 5 a.m. early one morning in March 1998 and still dark as road worker Felix Polanco exited his car and got into his excavator, again in Fajardo, Puerto Rico, but he was working on a new road being built between Fajardo and Olivares in the Sierra Bermeja range of mountains. So he gets into his excavator, turns on the excavator headlights, and saw something very strange in the headlight beams. And I'll just quote Felix directly, as he says, "I saw a little boy standing in front of it. He had long skinny arms right down below his knees, and very long fingers on his hands, though I can't say how many. I attempted to move and found that I couldn't, and I panicked. He was a thin, gray little fellow about 3.5 to 4 feet high, with a pear-shaped head, wide at the top, narrower below, with a small pointed chin. I couldn't see what clothing, if any, he had on. He was just gray all over. I didn't see whether he had any ears. He had no hair either on his head or anywhere. It all looked smooth, like a gray skin all over. There was no other color about him, no white or black or any other shade, just gray. I couldn't see his face at all. I could only see him from the side and the back, and at no time did he look straight at me. He just walked away towards the coast." So this really shook up Felix, and after this incident, he went to the work office. And he didn't say anything at first, but seeing that he was quite shaken up, his fellow employees asked him what was wrong. So Felix told them what happened and described this little gray alien boy he had seen. And they absolutely believed him and told him that this particular area was well known for UFO and ET activity, which he had no idea. And then, to everyone's amazement, and especially Felix, a UFO appeared in the sky. And as Felix says in his own words, "Just at that moment, some of the men shouted, 'Look! What's that? What's that thing up there?' and pointed to the sky. We all looked and saw something like a big red light flying on a west-east course. It was round and very bright, full of red light, and high in the sky. Suddenly it turned, and then turned once more, and headed off towards the Cabo Rojo lighthouse and vanished. One of the men suggested it was a UFO coming to pick up the little gray chap that I had seen." Of course, Felix doesn't know, but he certainly found that quite interesting. This case was investigated by Puerto Rico researcher Jorge Martin, and he learned that this case did take place very near the Aerostat radar station, and that this is an area with a long history of sightings. It's well known that UFOs are attracted to technological installations, so perhaps that was one of the reasons the ET was in that area. So perhaps it was the Aerostat radar station that was the draw for these ETs, because there were other encounters that were involved directly with that. Very hard to say, but certainly a strange case. And moving along, I like this case a lot. It's very unusual how the ET behaved and how the witnesses behaved as well. I call this the flying alien, and this occurred on June 4th, 2001 in Narli, Turkey. It's a great case because it involves 3 witnesses and was very well researched as well. It was early in the morning, around 7 a.m., again on June 4th, 2001, when 3 villagers, Fevzi Cam, his wife Selma, and their friend Ace Topaloglu were driving their tractor to hoe their tobacco field. Now, along the way, they saw this strange being standing about 45 feet away from them in a field. It was walking towards them when they first saw it, but seeing this tractor, apparently, this figure stopped, turned around, and began to walk in the opposite direction. And they could all see that this was a very unusual figure, so Fevzi leapt off the tractor and began to chase it, and approached to within about 6 feet, at which point he could see that this figure was very short, no more than 2 feet tall. He said it wore very strange clothes, sort of a gelatinous-like skin-tight suit. And in fact, it was all covered with wrinkles. His wife Selma was close enough to see these wrinkles and said it looked like it needed ironing. Now this figure did have black, oval-shaped eyes that looked to Fevzi like they were, quote, attached on the suit or drawn on the suit. Now he didn't see any arms. In fact, the legs themselves appeared to be joined together. He said the feet looked rectangular. They were red in color. He did notice a bright red light shining from the figure's head, the top of its head, which was very round and wide. There was also a glowing orange-red light on its abdomen. But to Fevzi, it looked almost robotic in appearance. And as soon as he got up close to this being, it floated right up into the air, some 10 or 20 feet high, or as Fevzi said, about as high as a tree, all in complete silence. So he's staring up at this thing floating there, apparently looking down at him, and he thought to himself that he would try to bring down this creature by throwing stones at it so he could examine it more closely. Now, he hadn't done this yet. He just thought about it, at which point this creature rose even higher. And in fact, Fevzi had the impression it was reading his mind. But he decided to anyway quickly bend down, and he began collecting stones and throwing it at this creature. He threw 4 or 5 stones, but the being easily avoided all of them. And it was just flying around, which really impressed the witness because, as he says, it didn't have wings or propellers, but it could fly upwards. And quickly left the area. So, a Turkish UFO group by the name of Sirius heard about this case, interviewed the witnesses, searched the area for any physical evidence. They found nothing in the field at all, but did discover that 2 other villagers had seen strange lights in the sky in the same area, at the same time as Fevzi's encounter. Fevzi and the other witnesses were vouched for by all of those who knew them, including actually the governor of the village and the town councilor. And researchers did receive further confirmation when they found out that 1 day later, 2 security guards at a nearby factory also reported seeing a being of the same description. So once again, we have beings which are apparently inspecting a factory. So perhaps that's why the being was there. Impossible to say for sure, but certainly a compelling multi-witness sighting. Quite a strange case. I wouldn't advise throwing rocks at ETs, but I can't blame the witnesses. They were confronted with something they have never seen before. And it is interesting that, in fact, there was a follow-up encounter with another group of witnesses and apparently the same ET. But this case was taken very seriously. It was researched. The witnesses were vouched for by those who knew them. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that this was an absolutely genuine case, but certainly a very strange looking ET. And now, moving to the next case, and again another location on this planet. I call this one Approached by an Alien. And this occurred on February 12th, 2010, again fairly recently. It occurred at Fear Park in Exmouth, England. And a very interesting case involving animal reactions and an apparent landing with a humanoid approaching the witness. The main witness in this case is Roy Shaw. He's a retired engineer. And on the evening of February 12th, 2010 again, he was walking his dog in Fear Park. This is not far from his home on Withycombe Village Road in Exmouth, England. And this is when he was shocked to see a UFO landed on the ground in front of him. Now he says he never saw it flying around or landing. It was just suddenly there. It appeared right in front of him. And as he says in his own words, the object was round in shape and about 30 feet in diameter and 100 feet long, with blue and red flashing lights on its perimeter. It appeared to land at the top end of the park by the bowling green. My dog started to growl when what I can only describe as a white shape came towards us. It was about 4 feet high and seemed to be translucent and moved very slowly towards us. I was transfixed because it made a droning noise which sounded like my over and over again, which I could not understand. I don't know where the sound was coming from, but it was coming straight towards me. Now Roy's dog, whose name is Sydney, is normally very friendly to strangers, but Sydney was not happy about this being approaching them and actually bared his teeth at this figure and then turned and ran. And in fact, Roy also became quite scared and also ran. And looking back, he saw this object was now hovering in the sky over a hedge. He watched it fly horizontally from left to right and then shoot off upwards at a 45-degree angle at very high speed. And as Roy says in his own words, I twisted my ankle when I ran like hell. My dog Sid kept whimpering and kept looking out the bedroom window towards the park until at least 2 in the morning. I had problems sleeping because I kept going over in my mind what I had seen. I still can't believe what I saw, and I am still in a state of shock. Sid doesn't like going back up there now. Something put him off. Everybody thinks you are a crank when you report something like this. I am an engineer. I like to touch and feel things. If I can touch it, it exists. But there's no way I can explain this. So this case was researched by UFO investigator Nigel Wright, who says, this is a close encounter of the third kind. This is definitely of a third kind, having an occupant of a UFO in close proximity to the craft itself. This is a really important sighting. I like that case because it was investigated. The witness himself is an engineer who was clearly quite affected profoundly by this encounter. Does again have animal effects. We know exactly where this case took place. So there's a lot of interesting elements to it. And certainly the ET described is quite unusual. If that's what it was, hard to say for sure. And here's the last case of the bunch. This is not investigated really. This was just reported to MUFON. But it's certainly an interesting case of an ET being seen very close up inside a craft. I call this one the 9-foot tall alien. It occurred on September 4th, 2022, very recently, in an undisclosed location in Oregon. So the witness in this case is anonymous, and again, this case is not researched, but certainly interesting. And it was just after sunset on September 4th, 2022, when the witness had his encounter. As he says, I was outside on the back patio. I looked up, and flying 50 feet or so above my house
was an occupied UFO. It was so close I could see the being staring directly at me and the control panel in front of him. He looked forest green, like the craft. He had black eyes, a small nose of sorts, a small round mouth, and stood about 9 or 10 feet tall. I knew I had the sense it was a male. I knew he was standing because his elbows weren't bent, as his hands, with 4 fingers, were resting on the control panel. The craft was about 30 feet in diameter. I know this based on the length of my house and the craft's relationship to it. The top part of the craft had a glass dome for the upper part of his body to be encased in, and there was a solid green dome, if you will, at the bottom. The shape of the craft was such that I could tell it was something that he stepped into. I stopped, smiled and waved, but he kept going and disappeared. So this had a strange appearance because he could only see like the front of the craft even as it moved off. And he says a week or so later, he had this strange impression that this craft was actually partly cloaked. And he's wondering if somehow this information was downloaded into him. As he says, he's, quote, not sure. But certainly a very close-up sighting of what appears to be an ET inside of a craft. Well, yeah, that last case wasn't investigated, but it's certainly interesting in how the witness rather, reacted by waving to the ET, and very brief, but also some interesting elements to it that I think make it a legit account. They were able to estimate the size of this craft. It was quite close. They feel like they got a download. It's just an interesting case, and yeah, very recent. A lot of you have been asking me to put up some more recent cases, and there you go. That's 100 years of encounters from the 1920s all the way to the 2020s. And there's a lot to learn from that. This shows once again that this is an ongoing phenomena. There's far more cases of this kind than people realize. Another very important takeaway is that yes, this is occurring all over the world. And in fact, I suspect that if you dig in, pretty much every location on this planet has a long and rich history of UFO encounters. And for me, another really interesting thing is the very many different descriptions people give of these humanoids. Humanoids of all kinds, from short little beings to very tall beings, wearing all different kinds of uniforms, all different skin complexions, different types of eyes. I mean, you name it. They are all different, very much like humans here on Earth. So that also is interesting. And of course, the evidence. The evidence is compelling. Some very profound physiological effects in this collection, some undeniable landing trace cases, which were thoroughly investigated, some really interesting electromagnetic effects and animal effects and so forth. So again, a lot more evidence as well than certainly skeptics believe, who often say, where's the evidence? Well, here you go. How many cases is it going to take before this is something that all humanity accepts is happening? Because you know it's not just a few hundred cases or even a few thousand. It's many thousands. I think probably more like millions. It's just that the vast majority go unreported. So that's it for today. Aliens, aliens, aliens. 100 years of humanoids. 13 true cases. So I want to thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep looking for answers, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, keep having fun. Bye for now.